One of my favorite pastimes of the past year has been poker, Texas Hold'em specifically. I'm not a natural strategic mastermind, like my wife, when it comes to strategy games of any sort. Texas Hold'em is no exception. Over the past year, I've been learning how to play poker from six-time World Series champion Daniel Negreanu. Negreanu is one of many renowned experts that Masterclass has to teach you how to do what's important to you. I've been watching Negreanu's nearly 30 lessons on poker, embedded with many of his examples from TV tournaments spliced in. Daniel Negreanu's Masterclass on Texas Hold'em has really helped me grow fundamentally sound at Texas Hold'em. There are hundreds of other experts who can help you grow various professional skills or your abilities in various hobbies. Check out Masterclass today using my link in the show notes. If you treat yourself to Masterclass using that link, you'll also be supporting the show. Now, onto our show.
This is Forgotten Wars.
Imagine that you're a British enlisted soldier marching in a land far from home. You're marching with about 250 other British soldiers and officers towards the capital of the Transvaal, Pretoria. When all of a sudden, your commanding officer comes sprinting towards your column, shouting orders frantically. Before he can reach you, all of your other officers are shot to the ground. You and your comrades have nowhere close to take cover. So you drop into a prone position in the grass, just inches away from other buddies in your company, and begin returning fire. To your horror, none of your shots find their target. None of your buddies' shots find their mark either, because your rifles are sighted for targets around 400 yards away. Your enemy is less than 150 yards away, and many of them found cover before they started shooting. You take a shot to the shoulder, but because you have typical British pluck, you keep firing. You hear laughter to your right. With blood trickling from his thigh, your friend continues to fire, laughing in the face of danger. You're hit again, this time through your upper torso. Your friend to your left goes silent. You turn to see his body twitch and go limp. You keep firing. You can't hit anything. You see no choice. You have to re-sight your rifle in the midst of this heavy gunfire to have any shot at hitting the enemy. It's a lose-lose. You're hit again, then again through the neck. You know it's over. As you feel yourself losing consciousness, you're asking yourself, how could Anne Struther let this happen? I thought Boers were only good at shooting Africans and lions. As your life ends, the first Boer War, the Transvaal Rebellion, has really begun.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire, but that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Active part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
Paul Kruger and company did not go without an enduring political fight after the British annexed the Transvaal. Vice President Kruger and a delegation traveled to London in summer 1877 to get Lord Carnarvon, the British Secretary of the Colonies, to approve a plebiscite in the Transvaal. Lord Carnarvon refused this popularity vote on British annexation. So then Martinus Praetorius, M.F. Viljoen, and Paul Kruger had petitions gathered in spring 1878. Of over 7,000 signatures gathered, less than 600 showed approval for British annexation. Piet Joubert and Kruger went to London to present these signatures to the new British Colonial Secretary, Michael Hicks Beach. Beach stayed steadfast on the Transvaal, remaining under the British thumb for a future South African Confederation. The Boer delegation returned and helped organize a policy of non-cooperation without independence in the Transvaal. Trying to show the advantages of having no independence under British rule, Governor Frere and Governor Shepstone encouraged the aforementioned strategy of subjugating the Bapedi, Zulu, and other Boer enemies. After Frere had much of his authority stripped from him, General Sir Garnet Wolseley stepped into several shoes at once: High Commissioner of Southeastern Africa, Governor of Natal and the Transvaal, and the Commander-in-Chief of forces around Natal and the Transvaal. When these British-led forces faced setbacks or defeats against tribes such as the Zulu, the British looked just weak enough to Boers to eventually overthrow. When these British-led forces triumphed in battle, many Boers were licking their chops as the number of powerful enemies were winnowed to one: the British. Many of you listening were able, at this very moment, to make the same connection as the preeminent historian of the Transvaal Rebellion, John Leband. Leband wrote, quote, "By removing the Boers' most pressing security problems, it allowed the Republican leaders to apply all their energies to anti-British agitation. In this, the consequences were not dissimilar from those in the 13 colonies before the American Revolution, when British victory in the 7 Years' War removed the specter of French invasion." End quote. Just as the American colonists could focus their efforts against the British after other French and native threats were neutralized, the Transvaal Boers could now focus their aggression against the British after the British handled the Zulu, the Bapedi, and Xhosa. Colonel Sir Owen Lanyon would replace Sir Theophilus Shepstone as administrator of the Transvaal. Colonel Lanyon had just recently administered the controversial creation, Herwequaland West. Lanyon tried to placate the Boers by giving them limited representation in the Transvaal's British-administered government. This went over like a lead balloon, with no reputable Boers serving in this government. General Wolseley didn't make things any better when he spoke with open contempt about the Boers. Quote, "A Boer's idea of life is that he should pay no taxes of any sort or kind, that he should be amenable to no sort of law he disliked, that there should be no police to keep order, that he should be allowed to kill or punish the natives as he thought fit, that no progress towards civilization should be attempted, that all foreigners should be kept out of the country, and that he should be surrounded by a wasteland of many miles of extent each way which he called his farm. In fact, that he should have no neighbors, as the smoke of another man's fire was an abomination to him. These Transvaal Boers are the only white race I know of that has steadily been going back towards barbarism. They seem to be influenced by some savage instinct which causes them to fly from civilization. Altogether, I regard them as the lowest in the scale of white men." End quote. General Wolseley jotted this reflection in October 1879. Mass meetings of Boers in December 1879 voiced willingness to die for the field clear, the Transvaal flag. But Paul Kruger was successful in persuading Boers later to avoid armed rebellion before the time was right. A force of unity would also feed fighting against federation. Stephanus du Toit founded a newspaper that didn't really succeed until the British annexed the Transvaal. As the newspaper grew, du Toit planted and watered the Afrikaner League, the Bond for short. This political party united nationalist groups in the Cape to try to counter English imperial influence in the Cape, and eventually the rest of South Africa. With du Toit and later Jan Hofmeyer's leadership, the Bond became the most powerful party across South Africa. This helped fuel Afrikaner press in the Cape and Orange Free State in their vocal support of their annexed Afrikaner brothers in the Transvaal. Hofmeyer and President Johannes Brand of the Orange Free State had originally supported the British annexation of the Transvaal. By 1880, both Hofmeyer and President Brand changed their tune. Hofmeyer wrote, quote, "The annexation of the Transvaal has taught the people of South Africa that blood is thicker than water. It has filled the Cape Afrikaners, otherwise groveling in the mud of materialism, with a national glow of sympathy for their brothers across the Fall." End quote. In spring 1880, Piet Joubert and Paul Kruger raised money and gave speeches against Confederation on a tour through the Cape and Orange Free State. Just months later, the Cape Parliament rejected South African Federation legislation. The Cape Parliament refused to consider federation until the British gave the Transvaal their sovereignty back. Now, before we get into the fall of 1880, we need to look at one of our earlier characters, a man with a life marked by irony and arguably indecision. William Gladstone led his first cabinet as the British Prime Minister from 1868 to 1874. What did I mention happening in 1871 during the Gladstone ministry? Those of you who excel at rapid recall will remember that the British solved disputes over Kimberley Proper's Diamond Territory by creating a new country, Harwequaland West, and then annexing that Diamond Territory into the British Empire. The Gladstone government presided over this annexation that drove enraged wars in the Transvaal and Orange Free State closer together. Benjamin Disraeli, remember the only Jewish prime minister in British history, began his second Conservative administration in 1874 after defeating Gladstone's Liberal Party in elections. 3 years later, Disraeli's ministry presided over the annexation of the Transvaal. In 1879, the Disraeli ministry presided over the subjugation of the Zulu. William Gladstone, Disraeli's political arch-rival, criticized the Disraeli ministry saying, quote, "The Transvaal, a country where we have chosen most unwisely, I am tempted to say insanely, to place ourselves in the strange predicament of the free subjects of a monarchy going to coerce the free subjects of a republic, and to compel them to accept a citizenship which they decline and refuse. There is no strength to be added to your country by governing the Transvaal." All these words rang true during Gladstone's re-election campaign. Gladstone and his allies also criticized the injustice done to the Zulu. But after all these criticisms, the Gladstone ministry chose pragmatism over principle when it took power again in 1880. The Gladstone ministry wanted to preserve its energy and political capital for dealing with their Irish problem and Afghanistan. Instead of giving the free subjects of the Transvaal their independence, Gladstone decided, quote, "Confederation is so important, it eclipses and absorbs every other consideration." While writing months after the Transvaal Rebellion, Gladstone's president of the Board of Trade provides possible further context for why the Gladstone cabinet chose Confederation over Transvaal independence. This Gladstone cabinet member wrote, quote, "When we came into office, we were all agreed that the original annexation was a mistake, that it ought never to have been made. And there arose the question, could it then be undone? We were in the possession of information to the effect that the great majority of the people of the Transvaal were reconciled to the annexation. We were told that if we reversed the decision of the late government, there would be a great probability of civil war and anarchy. And acting upon these representations, we decided that we could not recommend the Queen to relinquish her sovereignty." Gladstone wrote to Paul Creer and Pete Yobert on June 8th saying that the British could not let the Transvaal go because of the British obligation to protect British settlers and African natives. Ironically, Gladstone's cabinet member you heard from a moment ago, the bright and young Joseph Chamberlain, opposed this decision to keep the Transvaal under the British thumb. Those of you who know your South African and British history already know why Chamberlain's opposition was ironic. Chamberlain would eventually destroy the Liberal Party and then be one of a handful of British most responsible for starting the Second Boer War nearly 2 decades later. But I still risk making the problems faced by Gladstone's cabinet seem too simple. You see, even within Gladstone's own cabinet, there were 3 views of how to properly handle the Transvaal situation, and any other situation where British paramountcy was challenged. When it came to the Transvaal, humanitarian imperialists wanted further intervention to set up native trusteeships and bring tribes like Zulu under direct British administration. This faction was very concerned over the treatment of natives. The Whigs in Gladstone's cabinet argued that Boer revolts and any other revolts in the British Empire needed to be suppressed forcefully to protect British prestige and supremacy. That way any other people under British authority didn't get any ideas. The third faction included Gladstone and Chamberlain. Gladstone and Chamberlain's faction originally argued that the Transvaal should have self-determination and that not pursuing conciliation would be expensive. An unfortunate coincidence struck the Gladstone administration, rising Irish discontent and unrest to go with Transvaal unrest. The Irish question had a lot of weight. We will do a bonus episode all about that Irish Home Rule question. In short, you should know that many groups in Ireland had been advocating, violently at times, for greater Irish independence and stronger economic rights for Irish tenants who often lived on land owned by Englishmen living across the Channel. What got tricky is some of the men in Gladstone's cabinet who supported Transvaal independence actually favored a harsher response towards Irish nationalists. So how do these conflicting views within Gladstone's cabinet and within political parties play out? On January 6, 1881, the hardliners and the humanitarians won out. The majority of the Gladstone ministry decided to suppress the Transvaal rebellion that had just broke out. But Irish nationalist MPs, among others supporting Transvaal self-rule, pushed a censure vote in the House of Commons against the Gladstone administration because of the decision to suppress the Transvaal rebellion. 5 members of Gladstone's own cabinet refused to vote in support of the Gladstone ministry during this censure vote. This opposition, paired with President Brand warning that Orange Free State rebels could side with the Transvaal, led to Gladstone's government trying to negotiate some sort of Transvaal self-rule with Kruger just a month later. But now we're getting ahead of ourselves.
If you would like to help keep Forgotten Wars producing and growing, would you do at least 2 of 3 things? First, would you share a link to the podcast with someone you think might enjoy it? Second, if you're listening on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or other providers, will you make sure to like or follow our podcast? If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, would you give us a 5-star rating and write a thoughtful review there? You can even do that while you're listening. Lastly, if you want more from the show, bonus episodes, behind the mic access, transcripts and sources, and much more, and you want to support the show, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/ForgottenWars. That is patreon.com/ForgottenWars. The link is also in this episode's notes. Thanks to those of you who have done one of these things already. Know that you're appreciated. Now, back to our episode.
Gladstone disappointed Kruger, Joubert, and other Transvaal leaders when he decided not to give the Transvaal its independence back in the fall of 1880. But disappointment did not spell inaction. Kruger and other leaders began meeting secretly and organizing the mass purchase of modern weapons. Sir Bartil Frere, the High Commissioner who dismissed the Cape Colony's Parliament 3 years earlier, was finally recalled from South Africa in fall 1880 for his repeated overstepping of his authority. His temporary replacement, another man, Sir Owen Lanyon, who showed open contempt for the Boers, much like General Wolseley. Speaking of General Wolseley, Major General Sir George Pomeroy Colley took Wolseley's place as administrator in Natal and the Transvaal. General Colley then proceeded to inadvertently keep the Gladstone ministry completely in the dark about how much the Transvaal was on the verge of boiling. The Cape Colony created an all-consuming problem of its own in September 1880 when it tried to disarm all the Sotho tribe living in its borders. This disarming attempt sparked the year-long gun war, costing the Cape Parliament £3 million and turning Cape government's attention away from southern Africa's interior. Before the Transvaal rebellion broke out, the Transvaal was estimated to hold around 750,000 African natives, about 40,000 Boers, and about 5,000 non-Dutch Europeans. 1,800 British regulars were distributed throughout the Transvaal in November 1880. Sir Owen Lanyon, as South Africa's administrator, set to work establishing an efficient tax collection system, which, as many of you can anticipate, did not sit well with the Boers, who didn't like paying taxes to a Boer-elected government in the first place. Lanyon didn't only earn Boer hatred for his open contempt and tax enforcement. Though Lanyon was an Irishman, he looked to the Boers to be of mixed blood. To be ruled by a British man was bad enough. To be ruled by a part black man added insult to injury for many Boers. One of the first in a train of perceived abuses was British tax enforcement. I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like the American Revolution all over again. Stay tuned. Piet Bezuidenhout of the Potchefstroom district refused to pay taxes for his farms to the authorities. Piet then offered to pay half the amount if it could be earmarked for a future Boer republic. Quite the provocative move. That would be like the American rebels offering to pay only half of the stamp tax as long as that revenue went towards establishing an independent United States of America. Piet was defeated in court and then his wagon was confiscated and put up for auction on November 11th, 1880. The wagon bore both deep economic and emotional significance to the Boers. Whenever a Boer faced real or perceived injustice, the wagon could carry the man, the man's family, and possessions elsewhere. As Boers bore deeper into southern Africa and confronted more tribal enemies, the wagon formed the impromptu defensive perimeter against attacking tribal forces. When British authorities seized Piet Bezuidenhout's wagon, there would be hell to pay. P.A. Cronje rode into town with 100 armed warriors, seized the wagon, and brought the wagon to sit just outside a nearby town.
Sir Owen Lanyon sent troops, but Cronje's position was too fortified, so a long standoff began.
This story has an element of déjà vu to it. The man whose wagon was confiscated for tax evasion, Piet Bezuidenhout, was the son of Frederick Bezuidenhout. Frederick Bezuidenhout mistreated his black servant around 1815 and joined the ensuing Slaughter's Neck revolt that broke out when the British tried to punish him. Now here was Frederick's son 65 years later at the center of another armed defiance against the British. Paul Creer and Company's Folks Committee moved their January 8th public rally up to December 8th. Lanyon made two mistakes. He published a warning in the Government Gazette on December 6th, warning that any who attended the rally would be charged with sedition. But Lanyon didn't call in any reinforcements or even reallocate British troops in the Transvaal to enforce this warning. The rally lasted not for 1 day, not for 2 days, not for 3 days, but about a week. The Folks Committee got those at the rally to approve the reinstitution of the Volksraad, the Transvaal Parliament that the British had abolished after annexation. Paul Creer gave a rousing speech at the rally which included the following: "I stand here before your face, chosen by the people, in the voice of the people. I hear the word of God, the King of all people, and I am obedient. After the annexation, the people protested, have resisted and suffered, and would have attempted every other peaceful means had not the English authority in Pretoria made this possible. The rights of the people are on our side, and although we are very weak, God is a just God. My friends, may the Lord bless your activities and protect our fatherland." The Volksraad elected a triumvirate, a three-headed executive including former President Martinus Pretorius, Paul Creer, and former President Piet Joubert. Then the Boer military flew into gear. People began electing Boer officers known as field cornets. Yes, you heard that right. Most Boer officers were not appointed by superiors. They were typically elected by those who would fight under their command. At Creer's direction, the Boers at the rally also elected Piet Joubert to be Commandant General, leader of Boer forces. This despite Joubert's protest that he was not a general and not right for the job. But Joubert energetically began recruiting more fighters and more leaders. Piet Cronje, not to be confused with Piet Joubert, led a commando of 400 men to Potchefstroom to force one of the Transvaal's only two printers to circulate the Transvaal's declaration of a republic. In one of the first acts of war, Cronje's commando cut telegraph wires between Lanyon in Pretoria and General Colley in Pietermaritzburg. With Pretoria fortified by British troops, about 1,000 Boer warriors headed with the Transvaal's provisional government to set up a new capital in the small, easily defended town of Heidelberg, situated in an oval of rocky hills. The flag of the Republic, the Veldkleur, was hoisted on December 16th to great rejoicing at the new capital. Lanyon was given a 48-hour ultimatum to accept Boer independence. Even before Lanyon refused, Boer and Brit exchanged fire for the first time at Potchefstroom, where Bezuidenhout's wagon parked days before. Farmer Franz Robert sustained a wound to the arm, the first casualty of the First Boer War. The audacity of the Boers is striking in one sense. The Transvaal decided to rise up against the British Empire, an empire with iron control of the seas, an empire whose army outnumbered the Transvaal white population more than 3-1. But two distractions benefited the Transvaal rebellion dramatically. The aforementioned Irish question distracted the British government. The British military focused on suppressing the Sotho gun war in the Cape Colony. So single-minded was the military's focus on the Sotho war that even in September 1880, Lanyon assured General Colley that siphoning British regulars into the Transvaal to suppress the Sotho would be no problem. Lanyon still saw much more potential for African anarchy across South Africa. Lanyon saw no need to ask General Colley for reinforcements until November 25th, 1880. And even then, to generously paraphrase, Lanyon said, "When you get a chance, would you send me some more troops? No rush." On December 18th, 2 days after Veldkleur was raised over Heidelberg, Cronje's force set fire to a local judge's office in Potchefstroom, driving the 47-man British garrison there to surrender. The local British officer refused Cronje's demand to surrender all British soldiers across Potchefstroom. Instead, the remaining British soldiers piled into a 25-yard by 25-yard fort along with 48 other British sympathizers and their children, as well as 60 African employees. Boers from across town took turns as snipers, training their sights on any unconcealed person in the fort. Meanwhile, British Lieutenant Colonel Philip Anstruther is running behind. Colonel Anstruther received orders on November 27th to move his A and F companies in Leidenburg to the Transvaal capital of Pretoria, 188 miles away. Anstruther dealt with the real challenge of haggling for animals and wagons with local civilians, trying to make the most profit they could. Of course, it didn't help that these civilians were often Boers. On December 5th, 8 days after Anstruther received his orders to move, he finally did with far more wagons, 30, than military regulations said he needed for moving a 250-man force. He left behind about 50 men who did a thorough job fortifying their defenses in Leidenburg. The Boer strategy focused on simply containing British garrisons that were heavily fortified, like in Leidenburg and Marabastad, and intercepting British forces on the move. Anstruther's forces were on the move. If Anstruther's force had been as fleet-footed as a sister company that made it to Marabastad, Anstruther could have avoided disaster. Instead, Anstruther's heavily loaded force plodded along at about 9 miles a day, stopping frequently to give grazing breaks to its oxen. Historian John Leband writes, quote, "Such convoys were sitting ducks for mobile mounted Boer commandos and required all-around protection on the march, particularly on the flanks. Ideally, patrols ought to have moved parallel or in advance of the column to give early warning of enemy movements. However, since a single wagon in full span took up to 60 yards in column, this strung out a column on the march interminably and made it very difficult to guard. Rainy weather slowed Anstruther too. 2 warnings reached Anstruther's ear. He ignored both. Friendly Boers warned him that rebels in Heidelberg were stirring up men to oppose Anstruther's march. He took no precautions. A mounted messenger from British Colonel Bellairs warned Anstruther on December 17th that a 500-man Boer horde had left for Potchefstroom. The message urged Anstruther to send scouts to scope out hilly terrain ahead, specifically the Bueta Hill Range. But Anstruther didn't send scouts either. Maybe he underestimated the Boer warrior the same way that Sir Garnet Wolseley and Sir Evelyn Wood did. Wood typified many British officers' attitudes when he said he preferred Boers for shooting natives and driving cattle, and the British regulars for fighting. Maybe Anstruther stereotyped Boers on the whole as being as friendly as the Boers he met along the way to Pretoria. Whatever his inner thought process was as this 140-yard train of wagons and men inched forward, Anstruther would prove to be dead wrong. Anstruther's men continued to march lackadaisically as noon passed on December 20th. The soldiers only carried 30 rounds of ammunition, not the regulation 70 rounds for combat situations. 2 mounted scouts plodded 300 yards ahead of Anstruther's train. 2 more scouts hung back about 300 yards. Neither were distant enough to give much advance warning in the hilly terrain. When one of them did report a large party of mounted Boers heading to a flanking farmhouse, Anstruther looked through his field glasses and declared that his scout must have just seen cattle. The reality, 2 Boer commandos were riding parallel to Anstruther's train, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. Commandant Franz Joubert, uncle of Commandant General Piet Joubert, led a conglomeration of commandos to the east of Anstruther's force. Another commando followed along the west. The commandos picked a valley ahead to lay their trap. Before you hear any more about that trap, let's hear about unwritten rules, about different standards of chivalry. Why? Because one side was about to break some unwritten rules of battle. But lest you direct derision only towards the one who cries foul in this battle of Bronkhorst Spruit, listen to this flashback from more than 2,500 years ago. Historian John Keegan writes about fascinating case studies of chivalry, among many other things, in his book, A History of Warfare. Keegan writes, quote, "Chinese charioteers of the Chao period were clearly infected by chivalry. In a battle between the rival states of Chu and Sun in 638 BC, the Duke of Sun's Minister of War twice asked permission to attack the enemy before they had formed ranks, making the perfectly reasonable point that they are many but we are few. He was refused. After the Sun had been defeated and the Duke wounded, he justified himself as follows. The gentleman does not inflict a second wound or take the gray-haired prisoner. Though I am but an unworthy remnant of a fallen dynasty, I would not sound my drums to attack an enemy who had not completed the formation of his ranks. Keegan now continues. Other practices deemed unchivalrous among Chinese chariot aristocrats were taking advantage of a fleeing enemy who was having trouble with his chariot, he might even be assisted, injuring a ruler, or attacking an enemy state when it was mourning a ruler or was divided by internal troubles. The Chinese of the spring and autumn period disdained those who launched surprise attacks while they themselves normally sent messengers to arrange a time and place for battle. They also asked for fields to be plowed in such a way as to allow chariots easy movement, and there are repeated inscriptions about the need to fill in wells and cooking pits before a battle, so that chariots should have free passage." End quote. Why provide you this flashback from so long ago? To give you yet another example of how arbitrary unwritten rules in game and in battle can be, across time and place. In our story that will unfold just outside of Bronkhorst, one side is about to shatter the other's unwritten rules of war. At 1:20 p.m., Anstruther's force had only 1 mile before they reached Bronkhorst, where they would set up camp. At 1:20, the band of drummers stopped playing in shock when they saw Boer horsemen emerging on their left flank. Under a flag of truce, a dispatch rider met Anstruther and a couple British officers 100 yards ahead of the wagon train. He delivered a warning. The British force was not to take another step forward if they didn't want to declare war on the Boer force around them. The dispatch stated that the Boers only wanted their independence back and had no interest in fighting the people of England. Anstruther emphatically declared his intention to follow orders and make for Pretoria. But before the dispatch rider returned to Joubert, Boer officer Nicolaas Smut gave the signal to attack before the Boers lost their advantage. When Anstruther saw the Boer mounted men closing in, he sprinted back shouting orders. The Boers galloped and dismounted 140 yards from the British wagons and opened fire, targeting the British NCOs and officers first, with great precision. Mayhem ensued. African servants in the column fled or hid under wagons. While most Boers attacked Anstruther's front and left flank, Commandant Erasmus's contingent slaughtered most of the rear guard. Erasmus's men finished off any wounded Africans execution style with shots to the head. The Boers, in laying their trap, had set up stone range markers to help them aim accordingly at their British enemy. The Boers advanced using whatever cover the brush or stones provided, while the British stood exposed outside their circle of wagons wearing stark red or blue uniforms. Anstruther ran back and forth between his men, urging them to fight on, though he was wounded several times. But after 15 minutes, he knew it was over. His force surrendered. Anstruther died less than 3 weeks later from the wounds he sustained. The Boers were generous in victory, at least to those they considered fully human. They provided food, medical treatment, and transport to the British wounded, though not before looting for needed supplies and sustenance. Joubert held up the dispatch and gently reminded Anstruther that all this bloodshed could have been avoided. Commandant General Joubert proclaimed that God had granted the Boer victory at Bronkhorst. Afrikaners in the Orange Free State, Natal, and Cape Colonies were inspired, and some started to fill the Transvaal ranks. I will note that the account of this battle is also based off respected historian John Laban's work. However, Professor M.C. Van Sale and Dr. Jackie Hrobler reportedly disputed some of Laban's claims, whether that be about the Boers using stone range markers or about Boers shooting Africans down execution style after winning the battle. I just thought you should know. The Boers did get favorable treatment in the British press for their humanity towards British wounded, but gained infamy for a couple reasons. One, for breaking that unwritten rule I kept foreshadowing, for attacking the British force before the flag of truce had made it back to Joubert. 2, the murder of British prisoner of war Captain J.M. Elliot, as he and 3 others headed towards the Orange Free State. Elliot's murderers stood trial before the Chief Justice of the Transvaal, but were acquitted by the Boer jury despite overwhelming evidence against them. This miscarriage of justice would be resurrected by the British press 2 decades later to remind the public of Boer corruption. I have yet another limited time announcement for you on this July 23rd, 2021.
If you'd like to learn about a grander history of warfare, I have great news for you. Rather than letting the 20 or so books that I used to help me write this season of Forgotten Wars just sit in storage or on a shelf forever, I'm going to be mailing those books to loyal listeners like you. I consulted John Keegan's A History of Warfare to help me write this particular episode 1.8. If you're hearing this announcement, then you have the opportunity to win the book, A History of Warfare, by doing something free and simple. First, share episode 1.3 of the show via email or on social media. If you'd like an example of text you could use to share episode 1.3, check out this episode's show notes. It would go something like, want to learn about the Boer Wars and other clashes that ravaged South Africa after European settlement? Then start with episode 1.3 of the Forgotten Wars podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and most other places you find podcasts. Next, when people reply to your email or react to your share on social media, take a screenshot. Finally, send me a screenshot of your share with the accompanying responses you got from people. The first person to send me a screenshot that meets this criteria will get A History of Warfare mailed at my expense to them with a note of gratitude from me. Again, I will mail the book for free to the winner. Once I've got a winner, I will erase this announcement promptly. All right, share episode 1.3. It's a win-win.